The Hittites were a powerful ancient people who established a major civilization in Anatolia, modern Turkey, during the Bronze Age. Rising to prominence in the 2nd millennium BCE, they built an empire that, at its height, around 1300 BCE, spanned most of Anatolia and extended into parts of Syria and Mesopotamia. From their capital city of Hattusa, the Hittite kings ruled a realm that became one of the great powers of the ancient Near East, alongside Egypt and Assyria. They are renowned for their military skill, early use of chariots, and pioneering diplomacy, including the world's oldest known peace treaty. The history of the Hittites is a tale of a rapid rise, centuries of dominance, and a mysterious collapse amid the turmoil of the Bronze Age's end. The origins of the Hittite people are still somewhat mysterious. They were an Indo-European people who likely came into Anatolia from regions beyond the Black Sea, sometime around the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE. Instead of a sudden military invasion, the Indo-European Hittites probably migrated gradually, intermingling with the native inhabitants of central Anatolia, such as the Hattians, and adopting some of their culture. Over time, the newcomers became dominant, replacing the local Hattic language with their own Indo-European tongue, which they called Nesili, the language of Nesa. By around 1800 to 1700 BCE, several small Hittite-ruled kingdoms emerged in Anatolia. Early Hittite history is known through a mix of legend and fragmentary records. One important kingdom was centered on Kusara, and its semi-legendary kings of Kusara, such as Pithana and his son Anita, are remembered as founders of the Hittite royal line. King Anita, in particular, boasted of defeating various rivals and even cursed the site of Hatusa, which he had destroyed, in a famous inscription. Another key center was Nesha, also called Kanesh, modern Kultepe, an old trading city where Assyrian merchants had established a colony. The Hittites adopted cuneiform writing from the Assyrians, as seen on clay tablets from Nesha recording commerce and early political events. These tablets mention a land of Hatti, hinting that by the 18th century BCE, Indo-European rulers were active in central Anatolia. By around 1650 BCE, the Hittites unified their kingdom and established a capital at Hattusa, modern Boğazköy, Boğazkale, in Turkey. According to later tradition, a king named Labarna, or Labarna I, was an early ruler, and one of his successors, possibly his son or grandson, took the name Hattusili, meaning man of Hatusa, after rebuilding that city. Hattusili I is often credited as the true founder of the Hittite state and dynasty. Under his leadership, the Hittites began to expand beyond their initial territories. Hattusili I led campaigns north and south of Hattusa, and even struck far into Syria. He attacked the wealthy Amorite city of Yamkad, Halab, Aleppo, though he did not succeed in capturing Aleppo itself. Hattusili I's conquests laid the groundwork for a Hittite kingdom, and he sought to secure power by naming his grandson Mursili as his heir. The period known as the Old Kingdom saw the Hittites become a formidable regional power. King Mursili I, Hattusili's grandson, continued the expansion of the kingdom in dramatic fashion. In 1595 BCE, using the Middle chronology, Mursili I led a bold expedition down the Euphrates River into Mesopotamia. This campaign bypassed Hittite rivals and struck the distant city of Babylon, which was then ruled by the Amorite dynasty of Hammurabi. In a surprise move, Mursili I sacked Babylon, bringing an end to the old Babylonian dynasty around 1590 BCE. This astonishing raid made the Hittites briefly the masters of Babylon, an incredible reach for a power based in Anatolia. However, the Hittites did not remain to rule Babylonia. After plundering the city, Mursili I withdrew, perhaps due to overstretched supply lines and concerns about troubles back home. He may have handed Babylon over to his Kassite allies, who would rule there for centuries. Mursili's victories proved difficult to sustain. On his return journey to Hatusa, he became embroiled in internal conflicts. Not long after arriving home, Mursili I was assassinated by his own brother-in-law, and the Hittite kingdom was plunged into chaos. What followed was a dark period of bloody infighting among members of the royal family. One usurper after another seized the throne. Mursili's brother-in-law, Hantili I, took power but faced multiple murder attempts. Hantili's own relatives were killed by conspirators like Zidanta I, who in turn was murdered by his son Amuna. This lethal cycle of coups and assassinations severely weakened the Hittite Old Kingdom. The Hittite rulers struggled just to hold their core territories, while subject peoples at the fringes broke away. In these troubled years, late 16th century BCE, the Hurrians, a rival people to the east, seized the opportunity to make gains at Hatti's expense. The Hurrians took control of Aleppo and the surrounding Syrian lands, and in the southeast they occupied the region of Adania, Cilicia, renaming it Kidzawatna. The once mighty Hittites were briefly eclipsed by Hurrian states and other rivals. Throughout the Old Kingdom, the Hittite monarchy had not yet developed the absolute power seen in Egypt or later empires. Early Hittite kings were regarded as first among equals, rather than living gods. This meant that provincial lords and even royal family members had considerable autonomy, contributing to frequent rebellions and civil strife. Additionally, there was no fixed rule of succession, which led to War of the Roses-style rivalries between different branches of the royal family. These factors help explain why the Old Kingdom saw periods of expansion under strong kings, followed by sharp declines under weaker ones. Despite the turbulence, one Hittite ruler managed to restore a measure of stability, King Telpinu, reigning around 1525 to 1500 BCE. Telpinu is considered the last king of the Old Kingdom and is famous for issuing the Edict of Telpinu, a proclamation intended to end the lawlessness and regulate the royal succession. In this edict, Telpinu lamented the violence that had plagued the kingdom and set forth rules to prevent such crises. He designated the Pancus, a general assembly of nobles, as the high court for trying cases of royal murder or treason. Even the king himself could be judged by this assembly. Telpinu's reforms also clarified the line of succession to avoid disputes. Remarkably, the Hittites adhered to Telpinu's regulations for many generations, which helped curb the worst dynastic infighting. After Telpinu's reign, the Old Kingdom period came to an end, and the Hittites entered a quieter era. Following Telpinu, the Hittite realm went into a Middle Kingdom phase, a poorly documented century during which the kingdom's power waned. Roughly between 1500 and 1400 BCE, there are few historical records, suggesting instability or even a brief collapse of central authority. Part of the reason for this obscurity is that the Hittites faced constant attacks from hostile neighbors during the 15th century BCE. Chief among these were the Kaskians, or Kashka, non-Indo-European tribes living along the Black Sea coast to the north. The Kaskians harassed Hittite lands relentlessly, raiding towns and disrupting agriculture. At times, they even threatened Hatusa itself, forcing the Hittite court to abandon the capital. For safety, the kings relocated the royal seat to other cities, first to Suppiluliuma, then to Samuha, indicating how insecure the heartland had become. Archaeologists have found an archive of tablets at Suppiluliuma from this era, but it remains only partially translated, leaving many questions about this period unanswered. In addition to external pressures, the Hittites likely suffered internal fragmentation in the Middle Kingdom. Smaller Hittite splinter kingdoms or local rulers may have governed parts of Anatolia independently, while the central dynasty was weak. One positive development from this era was the Hittites' growing skill in diplomacy. Even in their reduced state, the Hittite kings of the 15th century BCE made treaties and alliances with neighboring states, an innovation that would become a hallmark of Hittite foreign policy. Indeed, the Hittites are among the earliest known pioneers of international diplomacy, negotiating agreements as equals with other rulers. They also began to absorb religious ideas from the Hurrians during this time, enriching their own culture. By around 1430 BCE, the fog of the Middle Kingdom begins to lift. A vigorous line of kings, often termed the New Kingdom or Hittite Empire period, came to power, reviving Hittite fortunes. The transition from the Middle Kingdom to the empire is conventionally marked by King Tudhaliya I, also called Tudhaliya I/II in some reconstructions, as the sequence of kings named Tudhaliya is debated. Under Tudhaliya I, circa 1430 to 1400 BCE, the Hittite kingdom re-emerged from obscurity and began an ambitious program of reconquest and expansion. The kingship itself grew stronger. Hittite rulers of the new kingdom asserted more authority and even started to claim a superhuman aura, addressed by their subjects as "my son," symbolizing their elevated quasi-divine status. The kingdom became more centralized and hereditary, which helped end the era of constant coups. With a firmer grip at home, the Hittites were ready to make their mark on the international stage once more. Under the New Kingdom monarchs, the Hittites transformed from a local Anatolian kingdom into a great power of the Late Bronze Age. King Tudaliya I and his successors led the charge. Around 1400 BCE, Tudaliya I allied with the state of Kizzuwatna, the former Hurrian land in Cilicia, and campaigned successfully against the Hurrians and other rivals. The Hittites reconquered Aleppo in Syria and even dealt a major blow to the Mitanni, a once powerful Hurrian kingdom to the southeast. By defeating Mitanni's forces and taking control of key Syrian towns, the Hittites secured a firm foothold in northern Syria. Tudaliya and his generals also turned westward, attacking Arzawa, a Luwian-speaking kingdom in western Anatolia, thus extending Hittite influence toward the Aegean. However, this resurgence was not without setbacks. After Tudaliya I, there came another weak phase in which enemies pressed in from all sides and even managed to sack the capital Hattusa. This catastrophe, the destruction of Hattusa, occurred sometime in the early 14th century BCE, possibly at the hands of hostile neighbors, Kaskians, from the north, or rebellious vassals. The invaders burned Hattusa to the ground, forcing the Hittite court into exile once again. Yet the Hittites proved resilient. A few years later, a new king ascended who would become the greatest conqueror in Hittite history, Suppiluliuma I. When Suppiluliuma I, Suppiluliuma, reigned circa 1350 to 1322 BCE, took the throne, he restored Hittite fortunes with remarkable energy and skill. He first consolidated control over Anatolia, quelling internal revolts and reasserting dominance over western regions like Arzawa. With his home base secure, Suppiluliuma then focused on the south and east. He crushed the kingdom of Mitanni, effectively ending Hurrian imperial ambitions in Mesopotamia. Mitanni's lands were reduced to vassalage, and some parts were even seized by Assyria, an ally-turned-rival of the Hittites. In northern Syria, Suppiluliuma conquered key cities that had long been under Egyptian influence, such as Ugarit and Aleppo, bringing them into the Hittite sphere. He installed two of his own sons as rulers, kings of Carchemish and Aleppo, thereby establishing a Hittite royal presence that would endure in Syria even after the main empire fell. Suppiluliuma I's successes made the Hittite Empire the preeminent power in the region alongside Egypt and Assyria. The Hittite king became a kingmaker in foreign affairs. In one famous episode, the widow of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun wrote to Suppiluliuma asking him to send one of his sons to become her husband and the new pharaoh of Egypt, a startling proposal that illustrates his stature. Suppiluliuma was initially cautious, suspecting a trick, but eventually agreed to send a prince. Unfortunately, the Hittite prince was murdered en route to Egypt, likely by factions in Egypt who opposed the alliance, and the plan fell apart. Even so, the correspondence, found in the Amarna letters, shows that the Hittites were fully engaged in international diplomacy at the highest levels. Tragically, near the end of his reign, Suppiluliuma I's victorious armies brought home a deadly plague, possibly tularemia, from the Syrian campaigns. This plague ravaged the Hittite population and struck down the great king himself, as well as his immediate successor, Arnawanda II. Despite this blow, the empire remained strong. Another of Suppiluliuma's sons took the throne as Mursili II, circa 1321 to 1295 BCE. Mursili II proved to be a capable ruler who held the empire together and even expanded it further. He campaigned vigorously in the west, subduing Arzawa and other rebellious regions. According to later legend, when a western enemy attacked the Hittites during the plague outbreak, the Hittites retaliated by sending infected rams into the enemy's land, an early instance of biological warfare, if the tale is true. Mursili II also dealt with tribes from across the Aegean, possibly Mycenaean Greeks called Ahiyawa in Hittite records, who were meddling in western Anatolia. By the end of Mursili II's reign, the Hittite Empire was at the zenith of its power, controlling a vast territory and boasting a fearsome military. The early 13th century BCE brought the Hittite Empire into direct conflict with another superpower of the age, New Kingdom Egypt. Tensions with Egypt had been brewing over control of Syria, a region both powers wanted for its strategic trade routes and resources. The flashpoint was the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River. In 1274 BCE, the armies of the Hittites and Egyptians clashed in the epic Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles in history. The Hittite king at this time was Muwatalli II, Mursili II's son, and he brought a massive force, including heavy chariots that were the pride of the Hittite military. Facing them was Pharaoh Ramses II leading the Egyptian forces. The battle was fierce, and its outcome remains somewhat indecisive in hindsight. Egyptian records, understandably, claimed Ramses II won a great victory, but the truth is that neither side achieved a crushing victory. The Hittites had initially surprised the Egyptians and nearly routed part of their army, but Ramses II regrouped and avoided disaster with the help of reinforcements. In the end, the Egyptians retreated south, and the Hittites held Kadesh, so in a tactical sense, the Hittites could claim success. However, Muwatalli's gains in Syria were not decisive or permanent. Both sides were exhausted by the battle, and neither could fully vanquish the other. The true significance of Kadesh is that it led to the first recorded peace treaty in history some years later. The constant warfare had proven costly, and eventually the Hittites and Egyptians chose diplomacy over continued fighting. After Muwatalli II died, around 1272 BCE, a succession dispute arose. Muwatalli's young son Urhi-Teshub became king, taking the regnal name Mursili III, but was soon challenged by his uncle Hattusili III, a formidable prince who had been commander of the northern provinces. A brief civil war ensued between nephew and uncle. Hattusili III emerged victorious, usurping the throne and exiling Urhi-Teshub. Despite the internal power struggle, Hattusili III turned out to be an effective ruler. Recognizing that the bigger threat to Hatti now came from the rising Assyrian Empire in Mesopotamia, Hattusili sought alliance with Egypt to secure his western and southern fronts. In 1258 BCE, he concluded the Egypto-Hittite peace treaty with Pharaoh Ramses II, a remarkable document in which both kings vowed eternal peace and brotherhood. This treaty, sometimes called the Treaty of Kadesh, though it was signed years after the battle, is the earliest known fully preserved peace treaty in the world. It established a formal boundary between the Hittite and Egyptian zones of influence in Canaan, and even arranged a marriage alliance. A Hittite princess was sent to Egypt to marry Ramses. With Egypt now a friend, or at least no longer an enemy, Hattusili III could turn his attention to the looming menace of Assyria. While Hatti and Egypt made peace, the Assyrian Empire to the east was rapidly expanding. The Assyrians had already conquered Mitanni and were pushing into areas the Hittites considered their sphere. Hattusili's son, Tudhaliya IV, circa 1237 to 1209 BCE, was the last vigorous Hittite king who struggled to contain the Assyrian advance. Tudhaliya IV managed to hold the line for a time. He even mounted an expedition to Cyprus, known as Alashia, to secure copper supplies, and possibly claimed the island for a while. However, Assyria's might was becoming overwhelming. In a major confrontation, the Battle of Nearia, circa 1230 BCE in northern Mesopotamia, Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta I decisively defeated the Hittites, signaling that Hatti's days as a great power were numbered. Tudhaliya IV lost territories in the east to Assyria and had to contend with increasing unrest at home as well. Still, he kept the kingdom intact and was able to pass the throne to his son. The last king of the Hittite Empire was Suppiluliuma II, who ruled roughly from 1210 to 1180 BCE. Suppiluliuma II oversaw the final years of a faltering empire. He did win some battles, notably a naval battle against Alashia, Cyprus, showing that the Hittites could fight at sea as well. But these successes were fleeting. The reality was that by the late 1200s BCE, the Hittite Empire was stretched thin and beset by problems on all sides. Decades of warfare, including civil wars, had depopulated the realm and strained its economy. Manpower was low, making it harder to field armies and also to maintain food production back home. The Hittites' old enemies in Anatolia sensed weakness. The Kaskians raided from the north yet again, and new invaders, the Phrygians, Mushki, Bryges, from the northwest, began migrating into Hatti's lands. Perhaps most devastatingly, the upheavals known as the Late Bronze Age collapse were underway. Mysterious groups of seaborne invaders, remembered as the Sea Peoples, attacked across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. These Sea Peoples ravaged coastal cities and cut off trade routes. They overran the Hittite-controlled areas of western Anatolia and northern Syria, even destroying the Hittite vassal states like Ugarit on the Mediterranean. With trade disrupted and enemies everywhere, the Hittite heartland could not hold out for long. In Hatti itself, as pressures mounted, the cities began to fall. At some point circa 1180 BCE, give or take a few years, the invaders and rebellious locals burned Hattusa to the ground, bringing an end to the Hittite royal line. Archaeology shows the capital was violently destroyed and then abandoned. Thus, after approximately 5 centuries of rule, the Hittite Empire vanished from history, so completely that later peoples forgot the Hittites had ever existed. The lands that once made up the Hittite realm were taken over by others. The Assyrians annexed eastern regions, the Phrygians settled in the Anatolian highlands, and Syria was left in the hands of assorted small kingdoms. The fall of Hatti was part of a larger civilizational collapse at the end of the Bronze Age, which saw many ancient states, including Mycenaean Greece and the Egyptian Empire in Canaan, suffered destruction or decline around the same time. Scholars have found evidence, such as tree ring data, that climate change and drought may have also contributed to this collapse. A series of severe droughts in the late 13th century BCE could have caused famine and instability in the Hittite lands. Although the great Hittite Empire had fallen, the end of Hatusa was not the end of the Hittite people. In southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, several Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite states emerged in the aftermath, 12th to 8th centuries BCE. These were smaller kingdoms and city-states that were culturally descended from the Hittites, often ruled by Hittite nobles or surviving members of the royal family. For example, the city of Carchemish on the Euphrates became the center of a Neo-Hittite kingdom, and its ruling dynasty was likely a cadet branch of the old Hittite royal house. Other Neo-Hittite states included Melide, Malatia, Tabal in Anatolia, Hamath, Gurgum, Patina, and others in what is now southern Turkey and northern Syria. They spoke Luwian and Aramaic languages but preserved many Hittite cultural traditions. For a few centuries, these Neo-Hittite kingdoms kept the flame of Hittite civilization alive. They built cities, made treaties, and carved monumental inscriptions in Luwian hieroglyphic script. Their art and religion blended old Hittite elements with Syrian influences and the styles of whatever empires were dominant at the time. However, they were much smaller in scale and inevitably became vassals to larger empires. By the 9th to 8th centuries BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was rising in Mesopotamia, and one by one the Neo-Hittite states fell under Assyrian control. Carchemish, for instance, was first made an Assyrian vassal by King Shalmaneser III in the 9th century, and later fully annexed by Sargon II in 717 BCE. The kingdom of Tabal and others were also conquered and absorbed by Assyria by around 710 BCE. After this, we hear no more of Hittite political entities. Their lands became part of other empires, and over time the Hittite people blended into the populations of Syria, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. Despite their warlike reputation, the Hittites were not only conquerors but also administrators and innovators. Their society was essentially feudal and agrarian, composed of nobles, common farmers and herders, artisans, and slaves. The king stood at the top of the social hierarchy. In the Old Kingdom, the Hittite king was a relatively primus inter pares, first among equals, but by the Empire period he was regarded with an almost divine status, referred to affectionately as my son by subjects. Upon death, Hittite kings were even deified in Hittite belief, becoming minor gods in the afterlife. The king's roles were numerous. He was the supreme ruler and lawgiver, the commander-in-chief of the army, the chief judge, and also the high priest of the realm. He was expected to lead campaigns, dispense justice, and perform religious ceremonies to maintain the favor of the gods. The queen, Tawanana, also held an important position, often engaging in diplomacy and religious rituals. In fact, royal women like Queen Puduhepa, the wife of Hattusili III, wielded significant influence in Hittite politics and international relations. The Hittites developed one of the earliest constitutional monarchies in that the king's power was limited by laws and councils. As mentioned, Telpinu's edict established the pancus, a council or assembly, as a high court that could hold even the king accountable for serious crimes. This suggests a rule of law unknown in some contemporary kingdoms. Additionally, the Hittite legal code was surprisingly humane for its time. Unlike the famous Hammurabi's Code of Babylon, Hittite laws generally did not prescribe the death penalty for crimes like murder or theft. Instead, punishment focused on fines and restitution. For example, a murderer might become a slave to the victim's family, and a thief would repay several-fold the value of what was stolen. This relative leniency may reflect the Hittites' practical approach to justice, aiming to maintain social order and compensate loss rather than exact brutal retribution. The Lion Gate at Hattusa, carved with protective stone lions, 13th century BCE. Hattusa's mighty walls stretched over 6 kilometers, with several elaborate gateways like this, reflecting the Hittites' martial culture and engineering skill. The capital city Hattusa was the pride of the Hittite Empire. Located on a high rocky promontory amid the Anatolian plains, Hattusa was heavily fortified. Its cyclopean walls, made of huge stone blocks, ran for miles around the city. Entry was through monumental gates guarded by stone sculptures, such as the famous Lion Gate, with 2 roaring lions flanking the passage, and the King's Gate, which featured a relief of a warrior god. Inside Hattusa, archaeologists have found the remains of palaces, temples, and storerooms. Notably, excavations have uncovered a royal archive of over 10,000 clay tablets at Hattusa, written in cuneiform script, primarily Akkadian and Hittite language. These tablets include legal codes, diplomatic letters, treaties, royal annals, prayers, myths, and literature. This rich trove has been invaluable in reconstructing Hittite civilization. For example, the Treaty of Kadesh between Hattusili III and Ramses II was found here on a tablet, as were detailed instructions for rituals and festivals. Religion in Hittite society was pluralistic and inclusive. The Hittites were polytheists who often said they had 1,000 gods. This was because, as their empire expanded, they adopted many deities from different lands into their own pantheon. They worshipped old Anatolian gods, like the Hattic and Luwian gods, along with Mesopotamian, Hurrian, and Syrian deities. The chief gods of the Hittite state were the storm god of heaven and the sun goddess of Arana. They were a divine couple and patrons of the monarchy. The storm god, often associated with the name Teshub or Tarhun, was depicted wielding thunder and was seen as protector of the Hittite nation. The sun goddess was believed to be a nurturing figure and linked with earthly sovereignty. Hittite kings and queens acted as high priests for the nation, performing elaborate festivals each year to honor the gods. One important ritual cycle was the spring and autumn festival seasons, during which the king and queen traveled to holy sites, including the rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya near Hattusa, to make offerings. At Yazilikaya, the Hittites carved a magnificent open-air shrine into the rocks. Processions of gods and goddesses in relief adorn the walls, with each deity identified by hieroglyphic labels. The reliefs notably include a carving of the Hittite king Tudaliya IV, embraced by the god Sharuma, underscoring the close relationship the kings claimed with their gods. Rock relief from the Yazilikaya sanctuary. The Hittite god Sharuma, son of the storm god, embraces King Tudaliya IV. Hittite kings were considered beloved of the gods, and after death a king would be deified in the Hittite pantheon. The Hittite military was one of the best of its era, famous especially for its use of war chariots. The Hittites are credited with helping to perfect the 3-man chariot, which was heavier but carried an extra warrior compared to the two-man chariots of the Egyptians. In battle, these chariots could provide a stable platform for archers and a shock force to break enemy infantry lines. The Battle of Kadesh is a prime example, where Hittite chariots nearly overwhelmed the Egyptian camp. The Hittites were also early adopters of iron technology. For a long time, scholars believed the Hittites had pioneered iron smelting and kept it a state secret, thus ushering in the Iron Age. Modern evidence suggests this is an exaggeration. Iron artifacts from the Hittite period are rare and likely made of meteoric iron. However, the Hittites did have some familiarity with iron working and may have ceremonially valued iron. The word iron in Hittite is even the same as sky metal. After the Hittite Empire's fall, iron use became more widespread across the Near East, but it's possible that Hittite smiths contributed to that knowledge. In any case, the abundance of metal resources in Anatolia, especially copper, silver, and lead, bolstered the Hittite economy. The Hittites traded metal goods and controlled important sources like the copper mines of Cyprus, hence Tudela IV's interest in the island. Day to day, the Hittite economy was based on agriculture and livestock. Farmers grew grains, wheat, barley, and tended herds of sheep, goats, and cattle. The state stored surplus grain in central granaries, like those excavated in Hattusa, which could sustain the population during times of war or drought. There was no coinage yet, so they used a barter system and metal by weight as currency. For instance, silver shekels could be used to value land or pay workers. Records show that 1 silver shekel, about 8.3 grams, was roughly a month's wage for a male laborer, and you could purchase a sizable plot of farmland for just a few shekels. This gives a glimpse of the ancient economy and standard of living. Hittite society also made use of captive labor, booty people taken in war, to address labor shortages and rebuild the workforce, a practice common in the ancient world. Another hallmark of Hittite culture was its language and writing. The Hittite language, called Nesali by its speakers, is the oldest attested Indo-European language in the world. Unlike most Indo-European languages which use alphabetic scripts, Hittite was written in a variant of the cuneiform script borrowed from Mesopotamia. Scribes wrote on clay tablets using Akkadian for international correspondence, but Hittite for domestic records. The decipherment of Hittite in the early 20th century was a linguistic triumph. When scholars read the Hittite tablets, they confirmed Hittite belonged to the Indo-European family, radically altering our understanding of how early Indo-European languages spread. The Hittites also left inscriptions in Luwian hieroglyphs, an indigenous Anatolian pictographic script, especially in the later Neo-Hittite states. Ultimately, by the Iron Age, these writing systems gave way to the simpler Phoenician-style alphabet in the region. After 1200 BCE, the Hittites faded from memory for millennia. Unlike Egypt or Babylon, they left no continuous tradition that later historians could read. The Bible made a few references to Hittites, but for a long time scholars weren't sure if those referred to the Anatolian Hittites or other groups. The term was used vaguely in ancient texts. By the 19th century, the very existence of a great Hittite empire was considered by some in the West to be semi-mythical or at best minor. This changed dramatically with archaeology. In 1834, the French explorer Charles Texier stumbled upon the ruins of Hatusa at Boğazkale, discovering stone ruins and strange inscriptions. He didn't yet know what they were, but he drew them, sparking curiosity. In the 1870s and 1880s, archaeologists found more inscriptions in Anatolia and northern Syria, written in the unknown hieroglyphic script and in cuneiform, referring to a land called Hatti and a kingdom of Khita. The puzzle pieces fell into place when tablets from Egypt's Amarna archive, discovered in 1887, mentioned letters from a powerful king of Khita, Hatti, written in an unreadable language. Scholars like Archibald Sayce correctly linked this with the Hittites of the Bible and the ruins in Turkey. Finally, in 1906, excavations at Hatusa, led by Hugo Winkler, unearthed the royal archives of clay tablets, conclusively revealing the lost Hittite capital. Thousands of cuneiform tablets once baked in palace ovens now saw daylight, and with them the history of the Hittite Empire was reborn. Within a decade, linguist Bedřich Hrozný managed to decipher the Hittite language by 1915, famously recognizing the words for bread and water in a tablet and demonstrating it was Indo-European. His famous translation, "Nun, bread, easy, I eat, yue, and water daxi, I drink," showed Hittites' relation to words in Latin/Germanic. This breakthrough opened up a rich stream of historical knowledge. Today, the Hittites are recognized as one of the great ancient civilizations, on par with Egypt, Mesopotamia, and others of the Bronze Age. Their legacy includes early examples of international law and treaty-making, the Treaty of Kadesh, advances in chariot warfare and possibly ironworking, and a unique legal tradition. In the Republic of Turkey, there is pride in Hittite heritage. Hattusa is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the Ankara Museum of Anatolian Civilizations displays many Hittite artifacts. The Hittites also left a cultural imprint on the region. Later peoples in Anatolia, like the Lydians and Phrygians, inherited lands once Hittite, and some Hittite descendants likely blended into Syrian and Mesopotamian populations. Even their language group, the Anatolian branch, has significance for linguists piecing together the story of Indo-European tongues. In conclusion, the story of the Hittites is one of dramatic rise and fall. They emerge from obscurity to build a Bronze Age superpower, face down rivals like Egypt, create a rich culture of law and religion, and then disappear in the storms of the 12th century BCE. Yet thanks to modern research, their voices speak again from clay tablets, telling of kings and queens, battles and treaties, gods and festivals. The Hittites' history, once lost, now stands as an essential chapter in the human past, a reminder of how even great empires can be forgotten, only to be rediscovered and admired anew by later generations.